Welcome back to Dark Night Scare. In today's video, I'm sharing 10 true disturbing Alaskan horror stories. So, grab your headphones, turn down the lights, and get ready. And please subscribe this channel and like this video. Thank you all. Now, let's start. It's remarkable how swiftly the wilderness can cause you to forget everything. The city, the people, the noise. All of it fades when you're enveloped by the vastness of Alaska. For years, I had been photographing the rugged landscapes, capturing the stark beauty of the northern wilderness. But I was completely unprepared for the eerie encounter that awaited me one cold winter day, in a place I'd never even heard of. A town named Cold Water. I was on my way back to Anchorage after a successful shoot in the Denali area, and I found myself with some extra time. That's when I decided to take a little side trip. I had heard from a fellow photographer about an old, forgotten town in the Alaskan interior, a place so remote it was missing from most maps, Cold Water. I had seen the name mentioned just once, tucked into an obscure travel blog reference, and my curiosity got the better of me. The road to Cold Water was narrow, barely more than a path carved into the snow and trees. It was the middle of winter, and the snow began to fall harder as I drove deeper into the unknown. The farther I drove, the more isolated everything felt. The trees were thick and close, their branches bowed low under the weight of the snow. I couldn't help but feel as if the world was becoming more confining, the air itself growing heavier. By the time I reached the town, the sun had already set, leaving only the snow's pale blue glow under the moonlight. Cold Water appeared before me as if pulled from another time. It was a ghost town, seemingly deserted. There were no lights, no signs of life, only the haunting shapes of decaying buildings half buried in snow. The streets were unnervingly quiet, as if the town was frozen in time. No sounds, no movement, just the soft whisper of the wind between the buildings. I parked my truck near the center of town, where old wooden structures stood above me like silent guards. A diner was the first building I noticed, its windows dark, save for the faintest hint of light from inside. As I approached its door, I felt a strange sense of unease, but I dismissed it. I had a job to do, and I was determined to get the perfect shot. The door creaked open, revealing the diner's dim interior. The tables were all set, with dishes still on the counters, untouched and unmoved. The cash register sat open, a few crumpled bills lying on the counter. It seemed as if someone had just walked out in the middle of serving lunch, leaving everything behind. I was stunned. It didn't make any sense. Why would anyone abandon a fully functional diner in this manner? I took out my camera and began photographing the eerie, deserted scene, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. As I moved further into the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a strange sensation, like invisible eyes fixed upon me, though no one else was in the room. Suddenly, I heard a sound. Footsteps. It was faint, coming from above, as if someone was walking around on the second floor. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't seen any signs of life upon arriving. It was impossible that anyone was here. Yet the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, growing louder. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. But there was no reply, only the echo of my own words. I cautiously approached the stairs, the old wood groaning under my weight. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. At the top of the stairs, I found a hallway lined with old rooms. The first door I tried was locked, but the second one opened easily. Inside, the room was covered in dust, and the bed was perfectly made, as though it had been abandoned in the middle of someone's day. I stepped in, camera in hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I saw it. A shape, a dark, shadowy figure standing in the far corner of the room, its back turned to me. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and stood completely still. I didn't know if it was a trick of the light or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the figure didn't move. didn't speak. I stepped forward, my breath catching in my throat. I called out again, but my voice felt small and insignificant in the presence of this thing. But as I got closer, the figure turned and I saw its face. Or rather, its lack of one. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a smooth, blank surface where a face should be. I froze. Terror spread through my body like ice. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. The figure took one slow step toward me, its movements jerky, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. I turned and fled, crashing through the door and down the stairs, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in my truck. I didn't even think to look behind me, but I felt the presence of something watching me as I drove out of cold water. The streets remained eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. When I got back to Anchorage, I tried to forget about cold water, but the images of the figure, of its blank, faceless stare, haunted me. I never returned to that town, nor did I tell anyone what I had seen. But there is one thing I know for sure. Cold water wasn't abandoned due to economic collapse or population shift. It was abandoned because whatever was there didn't want people around. A few months later, I tried to find cold water again, to document it properly. But when I looked for it on a map, the town was gone. There was no mention of it anywhere. No history, no coordinates. It was as if it had never existed at all. The road leading to my cabin had been buried under snow for days, meaning I hadn't seen another person since the plow cleared the week before. That's not unusual out here. When you choose to live on the edge of a frozen valley in Alaska, you accept periods of complete isolation. It's not loneliness if you know how to fill the time. Checking the generator, splitting wood, melting snow for drinking water, tightening screws, patching seams. Out here, the cold dictates the schedule. If you don't follow its rhythm, it'll make you pay for it. By the fifth night, I was accustomed to that rhythm. Wake early, keep the fire going, eat hot meals, stay busy. The wind usually provided company. A constant roar rattling the walls, making you feel surrounded by noise. But that night, the wind died down early. Without warning, one moment it was there, the next it was gone. That's when the cabin felt most fragile. You notice things you don't normally hear. The wood boards shifting, the faint tick of the stove cooling between logs. I was halfway through making tea when I heard it, a single sharp tap on the side of the cabin. It wasn't muffled. It wasn't random. It sounded exactly like someone knocking with their knuckle. I froze, holding the kettle halfway off the stove. I waited for it to happen again. Nothing. Maybe a chunk of ice had fallen from the roof and struck the siding. That's what I told myself. Still, I wanted to be sure. I slipped into my boots, grabbed my flashlight from the hook by the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The beam swept over snow that was smooth and perfect, stretching all the way to the tree line. No prints, no broken branches, not even the faint marks left by falling clumps of snow. Just an unbroken sheet of white. The cold bit through my gloves, faster than I expected. So I stepped back inside, shut the door, and set the kettle down, steam curling into the still air. The second tap came before I could pour the water. This time, from the opposite wall. My cabin isn't complicated. One main room, a sleeping loft above, and a low crawl space underneath. The only way to move from one side of the cabin to the other without leaving tracks outside would be through that crawl space. It's small enough that even I have to stoop to fit. And the hatch leading into it from the main room was always bolted shut. I crouched, pressing my ear to the floorboards. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate scrape. It was moving, crawling, heading toward the back of the house. I swung the flashlight down toward the hatch. The latch was still secure, but the sound had been close enough that my chest felt tight. I grabbed the wood stove poker, shoved the heavy stove itself across the floor until it blocked the hatch completely, and backed away 2 steps. Then the generator cut out with a single clean click. The cabin went completely black. No hum, no wind, just the sound of my breathing, too fast and too loud. I went to the window and eased the curtain aside just enough to see. The cord from the generator to the cabin was lying slack in the snow, its plug half buried like it had been pulled free. I layered up, thick coat, gloves, boots, and cracked the front door. The snow in front of the steps was still perfect, untouched. I closed the door halfway, then decided to check the generator anyway. My boots crunched over the frozen crust as I moved around the side toward the back. That's when I saw them. Not footprints, at least not the kind people make. These were deep, oval impressions spaced far apart. They started at the tree line and ended right at the back wall of my cabin. Judging by the distance between them, whatever made them cross that stretch in only 2 or 3 massive bounds. The hatch to the crawl space was hanging open. I didn't see drag marks. I didn't see an exit trail. The snow around it was undisturbed, except for those 3 strange impressions. I didn't even lean down to look inside. My flashlight beam bounced in my shaking hands as I backed away, each breath loud in my ears. I didn't turn my back on the cabin until I reached my truck. I was never supposed to be in Black Hollow that winter, yet here I was. I've told myself that so many times, as if repeating it enough could undo what happened, erase it from my memory, take away the way my stomach still twists when I hear a certain kind of silence. But memory doesn't work like that. It doesn't fade in neat, polite increments. It surfaces when it wants, like a cold, wet hand breaking the surface of a frozen lake. Photography had been my escape for years, but that winter it became something more. Maybe a crutch, maybe a trap. I'd been chasing stillness ever since everything fell apart. The divorce left me hollow. The bankruptcy was salt in the wound. Then came my father's heart attack, sudden and final, like the universe was trying to make a point I couldn't quite read. I needed silence, the kind you can't get in cities, or even in the quiet suburbs where lawns look manicured. But the air still vibrates with human noise. Alaska gave me that. Its vastness doesn't ask for your approval. Its cold doesn't care if you're prepared. It strips away the unnecessary from the landscape, from you. That December, I'd been out in the Talatina, wilderness, shooting frozen rivers where the ice caught the light like broken glass. Ridges that looked like they'd been carved by the hand of something ancient. Days alone with my camera. The crunch of boots and snow. The bite of air so clean you could almost taste it. When my last booking of the season cancelled, I found myself with 4 unclaimed days. That should have been time to rest, to head back to Anchorage and drink bad coffee in a warm motel. But I've never been good at sitting still. Not when there's still something unexplored out there. That's how the name slipped into my life. Black Hollow. It was just a whisper from a stranger at a diner in Fairbanks. He was an older man, heavy, coat zipped to the chin, fingers yellowed from tobacco. His eyes had that watery, permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many winters in the snow glare. "You like forgotten places?" he asked when he noticed my camera gear. "Sometimes," I said, not really committing. "Forgotten places can be tourist traps, half-hearted recreations. You should see Black Hollow," he said, like it was a dare. "Old mining, town way off the grid. Folks just left like they woke up one day and decided the world didn't need them anymore." I chuckled. "There's a lot of ghost towns in Alaska. Not like this one," he said. And the way he said it was strange, slow, deliberate, not like he was talking about a town at all, but about a wound. Something in me itched. "Where is it?" Instead of answering directly, he pulled a napkin from the counter, already crumpled before you even touch it, and scribbled a set of rough directions. No roads on a map, just landmarks. An old ranger station, a frozen creek, a turn where the trees look like they're praying. His handwriting slanted like it had been blown off course by wind. He slid it across to me without another word, stood, tossed a few bills down, and left. I didn't even see where he went. That napkin should have gone straight into the trash. 2 days later, I was driving north, tires crunching over a narrow trail carved through the snow. My truck felt heavier than usual, the cold gnawing into the suspension, every joint of metal complaining with sharp, dry pops. The further I went, the more it felt like the world was closing in. No traffic, no signs, just an endless, white corridor. By the time the first buildings emerged through the snow haze, dusk had already spread across the sky. Black Hollow. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks. The shapes were too still, too sharply cut against the dim light. A handful of wooden structures slumped into the drifts, their roofs sagging under, decades of snow. No power lines, no smoke from chimneys, no footprints. It looked amputated from time. I killed the engine and sat there, my own breath fogging the cab. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the open quiet of wilderness. It was heavier, padded, as if the sound had been drawn out of the air. I stepped out, boots sinking deep. The air bit at my face hard enough to bring tears. Every instinct whispered that I didn't belong. Still, I slung my camera over my shoulder and walked in. The first building was an old diner. Its windows were dark, but behind one, I thought I saw a faint orange glow, like a dying candle. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe the last smear of sunset catching ice. Still, my hand trembled when I pushed the door open. It groaned, the sound ricocheting into the silence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old grease, dust, and something sour that reminded me of spoiled milk. Tables were still set, dishes in place, forks resting on napkins that had yellowed with age. A menu board behind the counter listed specials for 1987. A cracked jukebox leaned in the corner, like a drunk who'd lost the will to stand. I raised my camera, started shooting. Each click of the shutter sounded too loud, like a hammer on glass. My breath felt thick in the air. That's when I heard it, a thump upstairs. I froze. Old buildings settle, wood groans, but this was slow, heavy, deliberate. Hello? My voice felt thin, swallowed by the air. Nothing. Then another creak. My gut told me to leave, but my legs didn't listen. I found myself climbing the narrow staircase, boots pressing complaints into the old wood. The feeling of being watched coiled tighter around my chest with every step. The hallway above was lined with closed doors. The first was locked, the second swung open. The room inside was lived in. A bed neatly made, a coat over a chair, boots by the door, but everything was buried under a thin layer of dust, as though no one had touched it in decades. I stepped in, camera in hand, and that's when I saw it in the far corner where the shadows felt thicker than they should be. Something stood there, tall, too tall, its head almost brushing the ceiling. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood like a cutout from the dark. "Hey," I said, though it came out small, brittle. It shifted slowly, turning toward me like a puppet on tangled strings. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth skin, no eyes, no mouth, just pale, glistening, nothing. The room dropped in temperature. Frost bloomed across the window. My breath came in ragged clouds. It took one step forward, jerky, wrong. I bolted, crashing down the hall, the stairs. The sound of those uneven steps too close behind me. I didn't look back. I hit the diner door so hard it almost ripped free. Snow burned my face as I sprinted for the truck. The keys slipped in my numb fingers. The engine roared and I tore out of there. The building shrinking in the rear view, but the feeling of eyes in the back of my skull never left. Anchorage's lights appeared hours later, blurred. Through exhaustion, I told myself it was hypothermia, exhaustion, imagination. But that night, dumping my SD card, I froze in the reflection of the upstairs window in my last shot. That face blank and inches from mine. A month later, I tried to find it again. Drove every mile, checked maps, forums, archives, nothing. No records of Black Hollow, no coordinates. It's like it never existed. But some nights when the house settles and the wind dies down, I hear it. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the floor above me. And I know I didn't leave Black Hollow behind. It followed me home. I arrived for my shift at 11 Wall, just like always, and by midnight, I was the only one left on duty. Our manager, Ralph, had completed his usual routine, locked the front doors, given a quick wave, and left the lot before his car had even fully warmed up. That left me to mind the shelves and listen for the side entrance in case anyone came in. Thing is, in this part of Alaska, especially in winter, nobody just drops by at that hour. The streets fall completely quiet after dark. You might get a trucker coming off the highway or someone from the harbour still smelling of fish, but most nights it's nothing. You get used to hearing only the hum of the coolers. Hour into my shift, I was stacking frozen meals when I spotted the back storage room door slightly ajar. Not much, just enough for the darkness inside to leak into the aisle. I always make sure that door stays shut, not because of policy, but because the building has this strange echo. You talk in there, and the sound comes back a little delayed, like it travelled farther than the walls should allow. I nudged it closed with my foot and returned to stocking the shelves. Probably whoever closed up earlier simply forgot. Around 2 a.m., I made my way back to the register. The screen was lit, showing a sale partway through. Item scanned, total displayed. My mind immediately went, wait, what? I hadn't rung anyone up all night. No one had come through the side door, or I would have heard the bell. I stared at the list. 2 cartons of milk, a loaf of bread, and one item labelled Other. No price, no description, just Other. I cleared the sale, feeling more annoyed than genuinely freaked out. I figured maybe I'd leaned on the scanner without realising it. By 3:10, I needed to restock canned goods in aisle 3. So, I headed for the back. And yes, the storage room door was open again. This time, it wasn't a sliver. It was wide enough for me to see straight down the aisles of boxes. Except the room didn't look 30 feet deep anymore. It looked longer, as if the walls had receded while I wasn't looking. The air drifting out was colder than the wind outside, which didn't make sense. It was well below freezing outside, and there was a smell, faint but distinct, like holding pennies for too long. I pushed my cart inside, its wheels squeaking. The overhead light flickered once, as if contemplating going out. My boots crunched on something thin, brittle, scattered across the floor. I bent down, rubbed some between my fingers. Could have been salt, could have been ice crystals. The shelves weren't where they should have been. I know that storage room better than my own apartment, and I swear things had shifted just enough to make me doubt myself. I walked to the far wall and laid my hand flat on the cold cinder block. Solid, just a normal wall. I grabbed the cans I needed and left without looking back. When I got to the front, the receipt printer was going wild. Paper had unspooled into a small pile on the counter. Most of it was blank, but near the end, faint outlines of numbers and dates started appearing. Some from years ago, others from years in the future. By 4 a.m., I decided I'd had enough of the back room for one night. Bread was the last item on my list, and then I'd just wait out the time at the counter. The second I stepped into the storage room, the door swung shut behind me. No breeze, no draft, just a clean click like it had been pressed closed by an invisible hand. I swept my flashlight across the shelves. A stack of boxes I didn't remember was sitting right in the center. On top lay a pair of gloves, small, like a child's, made of stiff leather, frosted over as if they'd been outside for days. I picked them up, and the box underneath rattled. Inside was an old receipt from our store, dated 6 years back. The items listed weren't things we sold anymore. Tinned coffee, peaches from a brand I'd never seen. Fuel tablets, under total, was a name I didn't recognize. Below that, thick black ink smeared into the word void. The loading bay door groaned open. Instead of revealing the parking lot, it opened onto more shelves, narrower, taller, all leaning inward, as if overloaded. Far back, a single light bulb swung slowly, making the shadows swell and shrink, like the entire place was breathing. Somewhere, in there, something was moving, a dragging sound, slow, uneven, like whatever it was didn't mind taking its time. I backed up with the bread pallet, never turning my back on the opening until I was out of the room. The rest of my shift, I sat at the counter by the side door, the bread sitting untouched beside me. When my relief came in at 7, he squinted and asked why the loading bay was open. I told him maybe the wind had caught it, though I knew the air inside had been perfectly still. He swore he hadn't touched it and said he'd been up by the generator all day replacing a belt. I noticed the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he said it. 2 mornings later, I found the door closed again, but the chair was sitting outside on the porch, facing the tree line. The frost on the ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks. I just stood there for a while, staring into the trees, trying to convince myself it was a prank. By then, I wanted to get to the bottom of it. Mark agreed to do the rounds. With me the next morning, we started at cabin 1, moving in order. Each one looked exactly as we'd left it until we reached cabin 6. The lock wasn't broken, it wasn't even damaged, it was just gone, removed completely. The screws were lined up neatly on the windowsill. Inside, every chair from the cabins. We'd already checked that morning was arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the floor. 8 chairs total, none from cabin 6. We didn't touch them. We stepped out, closed the door, and walked back without saying much. That afternoon, we kept busy inside the main lodge doing small repairs and sorting gear. We tried a game of cards later, but both of us kept glancing toward the windows. Around 9 p.m, the generator cut out without warning. That was a problem because without it, the heat would drop fast. We grabbed our flashlights and headed for the bluff. About halfway there, both beams caught movement off to the side. Something human-shaped, slipping between the trees silently. We both froze. I called out, "Hey, nothing." When we got to the generator shed, the access hatch was wide open. Every single tool from the workbench had been taken out and placed in a straight line leading into the woods. The line stretched beyond what our lights could reach. We didn't follow it. We closed the hatch, left the tools where they were, and walked back to the lodge without talking. That night, the knocking started. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more, always from a different wall, moving around us in a slow circle. We sat there, not saying anything, just listening. When daylight finally came, we opened the lodge's main door and found all 8 chairs from the cabins stacked in a tall, unstable tower right in front of the entrance. The thing swayed in the breeze, but didn't fall. We didn't wait for a 3rd night. We radioed for pickup. The pilot arrived that afternoon, didn't ask a single question, just loaded us up and got us out. I was 22, the winter it all started. Young enough to believe I could outlast anything. Old enough to think I'd already seen the hard edges of the world. I hadn't, not until Grayson Island. That place was a name nobody said twice, like people were afraid it might stick to them if they lingered on it. I remember the day I got the call. My boots were still muddy from field drills. My hands raw from the cold, fresh out of AIT, wearing the kind of pride you only get before life has taken its pound of flesh. 6 months on a remote Alaskan island for a National Guard training mission. 6 months away from strip malls, traffic lights, and the kind of noise you forget is noise until it's gone. The brass made it sound like an adventure. A little security detail for government property, they said. Keep an eye on a half-built project the Corps engineers had started before the weather chased them out. Plywood huts, skeletal framework for a mess hall. Nothing worth stealing unless you counted diesel heaters that belched more fumes than warmth. There were rumors. They always start with "you didn't hear it from me" and end with "but that's what they say." Native kids from nearby villages bored in the winter hopping island to island and vandalizing old logging camps. It was a believable enough story to keep us from asking questions, but there was something in the way the higher-ups skimmed past the details that felt unfinished. We shipped out in November, 6 of us. Sergeant Mike Halbrook, 35, the kind of man who smoked Camels like. Each one was the last cigarette on Earth. Corporal Danny Ruiz, quick with sarcasm, the sort of guy who could make misery feel like a joke, which was probably why I liked him. Doc Henderson, quiet medic who read paperbacks by the dozen. PFC Kyle Skavinsky, big farm boy from Minnesota, strong enough to lift a truck and just as awkward as you'd expect. Specialist Tony Kim, our tech guy, thin, precise, hands always moving even when his mouth wasn't. And me, Specialist Luke Mercer, trying to keep my head down and my fingers from freezing. The rotation meant only 4 of us stayed at any given time. No electricity except what the generator spat out in angry bursts. No plumbing, just an outhouse set 200 yards away because the ground around camp was culturally sensitive. That's what they called it. No one bothered explaining what it meant. But the way Halbrook avoided the topic told me he didn't care to think about it either. The first weeks weren't bad. We played cards, swapped stories, and listened to scratchy Art Bell shows when the radio signal cooperated. Nights were long and quiet. So quiet it was like sound itself froze in the air. The cold made everything sharper. The stars, the creak of the walls, the edges of my own thoughts. Then came mid-January. That day the wind died, and with it went the faint comfort of movement in the world. We'd been iced in for weeks. No supply boat, no visitors. The bay was a sheet of glass you could walk on if you didn't mind losing toes to frostbite. The outhouse was worse than usual. The kind of cold that bit through you while the stench clawed up from below. That night, we were in the main hut listening to Doc's copy of Contact on cassette, because it was either that or another call-in show about alien abductions. Ski was dozing. Ruiz was flipping a deck of cards in his hands and the heater was ticking, in that tired way old machines do when they're close to giving up. Then crunch. It was faint, deliberate, out in the snow. Ruiz stopped the tape mid-line. Nobody spoke. Another crunch closer this time. Probably ice shifting, Kim whispered, though his voice cracked. No ice left to shift, Halbrook said without looking up. I'd seen that look before. Jaw tight, eyes scanning for something his mouth wasn't ready to name. The island had been dead silent for weeks. No birds, no wolves, no echoes of anything living. Now there was something out there, and it was moving toward us. Native kids, Ruiz's. Guess finally decided to mess with us. Halbrook shook his head. They'd be making noise. This is different. The crunching stopped. Then came breathing. Slow, heavy, close enough that it pushed through the thin plywood like a second heartbeat. My skin prickled under every layer I had on. Halbrook motioned to me and Ruiz. We reached for our rifles, forgetting for a second they were as harmless as curtain rods without ammo. The breathing went on forever. Then, low guttural half growl, half something worse, and silence. We waited 5 minutes, 10, 15. The air felt heavier with every second. Open it, Halbrook said finally. No way, Rue muttered. Open it. I cracked the door with hands that didn't feel like my own. It groaned, the sound ricocheting into the silence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old grease, dust, and something sour that reminded me of spoiled milk. Tables were still set, dishes in place, forks resting on napkins that had yellowed with age. A menu board behind the counter listed specials for 1987. A cracked jukebox leaned in the corner, like a drunk who'd lost the will to stand. I raised my camera, started shooting. Each click of the shutter sounded too loud, like a hammer on glass. My breath felt thick in the air. That's when I heard it, a thump upstairs. I froze. Old buildings settle, wood groans, but this was slow, heavy, deliberate. Hello. My voice felt thin, swallowed by the air. Nothing. Then another creak. My gut told me to leave, but my legs didn't listen. I found myself climbing the narrow staircase, boots pressing complaints into the old wood. The feeling of being watched coiled tighter around my chest with every step. The hallway above was lined with closed doors. The first was locked, the second swung open. The room inside was lived in. A bed neatly made, a coat over a chair, boots by the door. But everything was buried under a thin layer of dust, as though no one had touched it in decades. I stepped in, camera in hand, and that's when I saw it in the far corner where the shadows felt thicker than they should be. Something stood there, tall, too tall, its head almost brushing the ceiling. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood, like a cutout from the dark. "Hey!" I said, though it came out small, brittle. It shifted slowly, turning toward me like a puppet on tangled strings. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth skin. No eyes, no mouth, just pale, glistening, nothing. The room dropped in temperature. Frost bloomed across the window. My breath came in ragged clouds. It took one step forward. Jerky. Wrong. I bolted, crashing through the door and down the stairs, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back in my truck. I didn't even think to look behind me, but I felt the presence of something watching me as I drove out of the area. The streets remained eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight. When I got back to Anchorage, I tried to forget about the island, but the images of the figure, of its blank, faceless stare, haunted me. I never returned to that island, nor did I tell anyone what I had seen. But there is one thing I know for sure. Grayson Island wasn't abandoned due to some economic collapse or a shift in military needs. It was abandoned because whatever was there didn't want people around. A few months later, I tried to find the island again, to document it properly. But when I looked for it on a map, the island was gone. There was no mention of it anywhere, no history, no coordinates. It was as if it had never existed at all. The last winter I spent in Alaska felt like the quietest, coldest, and ultimately strangest period of my 34 years. I was working a seasonal contract as a highway depot caretaker along the Dalton Highway, the route stretching from Fairbanks Way up to Dead Horse through endless frozen wilderness. There wasn't much between the endpoints besides snow, hills, and the occasional trucker hoping their engine wouldn't freeze mid-journey. I didn't mind solitude. In fact, I preferred it. That was part of the appeal. No neighbors, no small talk, no traffic, just me, the Suburban I parked near Depot 1, and the road. The job itself was straightforward. Every night between midnight and 5 a.m., I had to check on 4 maintenance depots scattered across my section. These small prefab structures were equipped with propane heaters, cots, emergency food, backup radios, and laminated instructions taped to the wall. Essentially survival shelters for stranded drivers. My role was to ensure they were ready, if someone needed them. They gave me an old tracked Suburban for the route. It was a huge, slow, clunky vehicle that sounded like a shaking tool chest over bumps, but it never once got stuck, not even when snowdrifts were halfway up the windshield. I parked my trailer near Depot 1, right off a dip in the road crossing a frozen creek. It was the most central spot and the only level enough to set up long-term. Cell service was non-existent out there. All communication relied on a patchy two-way radio system that only worked somewhat when the weather cooperated and I wasn't too deep in the hills. Mostly it was just me, the silence and the hum of the heater. The first week was exactly as I'd hoped. It involved long drives, cold fingers, and a lot of quiet. I'd stop at each depot, log the temperature on the clipboard, check propane levels, test the emergency gear, and make sure no animals had chewed through a wall or burrowed into the supply bins. Then I'd head back, heat something up, pass out, and repeat. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place happened. That changed on the 9th night. Pulling up to Depot 2, I thought something seemed odd. It was subtle, just the interior lights visible through the frosted window. I actually stopped the truck a few yards early and sat for a moment, trying to recall if I'd left the lights on the previous night, but I knew I hadn't. The sensors inside the depot trigger the lights, so if they were on, Something must have moved inside there. Someone. I got out and checked around. No tire tracks, no footprints, just a clean, untouched layer of snow. When I opened the door, a wave of warmth hit me, warm air and a smell. Savory, meaty, like beef stew, which was definitely not what I expected upon stepping into an empty shelter in the middle of nowhere. There was a cup sitting on the counter, one of the freeze-dried meals from the emergency, rations, beef stew, just like the smell. It had been opened and half consumed. The spoon was still in it, angled as if someone had just set it down mid-bite. And off to the left, in the corner of the room, was a single boot. Just one. It was scuffed and muddy, unlaced as if it had been pulled off quickly. No matching boot, no coat, no bag, and still no one there. I checked everything. Windows were locked. The door shut tight. No marks in the snow. No signs of entry or exit. I stood there longer than I should have, then finally logged it as a sensor malfunction and made a note to check the power system the next day. Turned off the lights, manually locked up and drove off, not fully processing what I'd just witnessed. The next night, when I pulled up again, it was the same. Lights on, no tracks. Same cup, same stew, still half full, but the spoon had been moved. Now it was balanced across the rim of the cup, neatly, almost deliberately placed. The boot was still there, same position. Again, no prints, no signs anyone had walked in, but someone or something had clearly touched that spoon. This time, I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, looking at the cup, then the boot, then back to the door. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Some movement, some clue. Nothing happened. I left without logging the visit. By the 11th night, I was on edge. I pulled up, got out, already bracing for whatever weirdness I'd find. And sure enough, this time there were two boots. Same style, same size, sitting side by side under the counter, laces loosely knotted together as if whoever was doing this was building something one step at a time. That's when I radioed dispatch, asked him for clarification. Was someone else authorized to use these depots? Maybe a stranded trucker too embarrassed to call for help? They confirmed, no, there were no drivers logged in your sector. No one else was using the buildings. I asked about the keys. Could a spare have been issued without my knowledge? They said only I had access. I didn't ask anything further after that. I just hung up and started planning how I would catch whoever was responsible. On the 12th night, I altered my routine. Didn't drive the route. Instead, I went to a ridge from where I could see Depot 2 below. I turned off the lights, sat in the Suburban with binoculars, and waited. Snow was falling gently, but the wind had died down. I sat there for over 2 hours. Nothing moved. The depot sat in total silence. Then, exactly at 3:47 a.m., the interior lights clicked on. I hadn't seen anyone go in. I sprinted down the hill, heart pounding so hard I thought I'd be sick. I opened the door. The scent of hot stew hung in the air. The spoon was spinning slightly, as if someone had just stirred it. The boots were now standing upright facing the door. I backed out slowly and shut the door without a word. Got back in the Suburban and didn't write a single note in the logbook. The next night I checked my clipboard. Depot 2 had been removed from my schedule. Now I was directed to Depot 4, much farther in the opposite direction. I drove the 60 miles, arrived there a little after 2 a.m. Same scene. Stew, boots, spoon wobbling in the broth. The next night, a different depot. Same setup. It didn't matter. Where I went, the scene followed. Always identical, always waiting. But gradually the freshness began to fade. The stew wasn't steaming anymore. It was lukewarm, then cold. The spoon stopped spinning. The boots slumped. Leather cracked at the seams. One night, the stew was gone entirely. Just an empty cup. No spoon. By the 15th night, I'd had enough. I locked myself in my trailer and completely ignored the schedule. Nothing happened. The next night, same thing. Quiet. No stew, no lights, No signs. For a minute, I let myself believe it was over. Then came the 18th night. I woke up around 2:15. The heater was blasting, which was strange. I hadn't set the timer. I stood up, walked toward the kitchenette. There on the table was a cup of stew, steam rising from it. And right next to it, my boots, not similar ones, mine, exact scuff on the left heel. Same little burn on the right toe from dropping a spark plug a few weeks back. They were upright, standing side by side, soles still wet with snow. I didn't think, just went back to my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my flashlight on until the sun came up. By noon, I'd packed everything, didn't stop to eat, just drove straight back to Fairbanks, dropped the keys at the company office, ended the trailer lease, and booked a flight out. I had been planning the trip for months, but the actual decision to go solidified during a single sleepless night. It wasn't an impulsive, adrenaline-fueled choice. It felt heavier, like a quiet resolve that had built over years until it finally reached a tipping point. I needed out of the city, out of the relentless daily grind, out from under the oppressive weight of noise and expectation. No phone constantly buzzing in my pocket. No overflowing inbox demanding attention. No neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. Just me, a tent, a river, and the kind of profound quiet my father used to describe in the dark before bed when I was a child. My dad grew up in a small logging town on the Kenai Peninsula. His stories painted Alaska with colors no photograph or postcard could capture. He spoke of rivers so clear you could count the spots on a trout's back without casting a line. Mountains that seemed brushed into existence by a hand that understood permanence, and skies so vast they made you feel like you were staring into the mouth of forever. He always concluded those stories the same way. Out there, you figure out who you are. Son, for years I thought I grasped his meaning. I didn't. Not until life felt grey and brittle. My job was stagnating into a dead end. My relationship was rotting from the inside. Nights stretched into long periods staring at the ceiling fan. That's when the idea stopped being a vague someday and became a map pinned to my wall. I bought new boots, dug my old tent out from the back of the closet, packed my Smith & Wesson 10 revolver, not because I expected trouble, but because Alaska has bears, and bears don't care about human epiphanies. I bought a ticket north. The plan was simple: 3 nights along the Chica River Basin. I wasn't aiming for the true wild, just a few miles off some old ATV trails, close enough that if things went sideways, I could get out without making the evening news, far enough to feel like I'd stepped off the map. The first day turned out to be what I'd hoped for, air so clean it almost burned to breathe. The cold was sharp, but not cruel. It woke you up, established a rhythm in your blood. I hiked in about 3 miles before finding a patch of flat ground nestled between 2 massive spruce trees. The river flowed nearby, like a lazy silver ribbon. From there, the view opened toward distant peaks that seemed indifferent, making you feel small in the right way. I set up camp, prepared the fire pit, and went down to the river. While I waited for the sky to reveal itself, I gave my usual talk about the Susitna River supposedly crawling with grizzly bears, as my dad used to say. Either he exaggerated or the fish had relocated because the river proved stingy. Hours passed without a single bite, making me think maybe I'd lost whatever knack I once possessed. That's when I noticed the first odd occurrence. The fish visible in the deeper pools started thrashing, not darting away as if spooked, but scattering in every possible direction simultaneously. A few even leapt completely out of the water, hitting the surface with sharp slaps that echoed between the trees. It was chaotic, frantic, and then suddenly still, as if whatever panic had seized them vanished instantly. I stood there, rod in hand, waiting for an obvious explanation. Maybe a predator moving through the current. Maybe just some natural event I hadn't learned to read. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered, noticeable only in that quiet, small way you realize later. By late afternoon, I'd managed to catch 2 small fish, enough for dinner if I wasn't picky. I wandered upstream, exploring with my camera, filling my lungs with air that felt filtered through stone and snow. But the quiet wasn't absolute. Somewhere in the distance, beneath the soft rush of the river, there was a low buzzing, faint at first, the kind of thing you thought might just be in your head. It would swell for a few seconds, then fade completely, only to return minutes later. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to spot a dirt bike or an ATV tearing around in the distance, but there was nothing. No smoke, no movement, just trees holding their silence. By sunset, the sound had ceased, or perhaps I'd stopped noticing it. I cleaned the fish, stuffed them with butter and garlic, grilled them over a small fire until the skin crisped and the meat flaked. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. When the fire dwindled, I headed toward the tree line to gather more wood. That's when I froze. Across the river, in the dense shadow between the spruce trees, something moved. It wasn't the erratic motion of an animal startled into flight. This was slow, deliberate, a shape shifting between the trunks like smoke curling through. A room. Hello. My voice sounded sharper than intended, carrying across the water. The shape didn't answer, didn't shift, didn't seem to acknowledge me at all. I stepped to the side, trying to see around the trees, but the shadows swallowed whatever it had been. My stomach tightened. I told myself it could have been anything. An elk, a shadow, a trick of my eyes. But the feeling that I was being watched clung to me like damp cloth. I made my way back to camp faster than before. Every crunch of frost under my boots sounded too loud. I built the fire higher than necessary. The light spilled out into the dark like a small, stubborn island. I kept my gun across my lap, telling myself it was just caution. By the time the fire died to embers, I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I zipped myself into my tent, the sturdy canvas type with enough room to stand and lay still, listening to the forest breathe. Sleep came slowly, more like drifting into deep water than crossing a threshold. I woke to light, not sunlight. This was white, cold, and bright enough to burn through my closed eyelids. My first thought was flashlight. Maybe that figure I'd seen had followed me. My hand went to the pistol, heart thudding. I unzipped the flap. The camp was still, the fire dead, just a smear of dull orange in the pit. Trees stood black and silent. Then I saw it, not on the ground. Above it, a column of white light poured from the sky onto the trees, no wider than a small room, no softer than a surgical lamp. It was so perfect, so still, it looked solid. The trunks caught in it seemed scrubbed of their color, their bark flat and pale. No sound, no wind, just that impossible beam hanging there 15 ft from my tent. My mind raced for explanations. Helicopter, drone, some aurora phenomenon I didn't understand. But there was no rotor chop, no hum of engines, nothing but silence so deep it pressed into my ears. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. 1 second, the clearing was carved in white. The next, it was swallowed in black. I stayed frozen, the gun shaking in my hands. My first instinct was to get to the truck, leave everything behind, just drive until the fuel gauge dipped under empty. But the trail was mud and roots. And in the dark, I wasn't sure I could even find it. The light came back. This time, it was directly over my tent. The shadows fled in every direction. I staggered back, blind spots blooming in my vision. That's when I heard the buzzing again, not faint, not far, but loud, a vibration that made my teeth ache. I bolted. Jacket, boots, gun, nothing else. I tore into the tree line, branches clawing at my face, lungs screaming. Behind me, the beam swung through the canopy like a blade, searching. I don't know how far. I ran. 1/2 mile, maybe more. The ground tilted up and I scrambled onto a rocky slope where a dead oak clung to the hillside. I hauled myself into its branches, bark biting into my palms and pressed flat against the trunk. The forest below glowed in white. The beams swept through the clearing, slow, deliberate. When it passed over my camp, I saw the tent flap, hanging open like a wound. It lingered there, motionless, as if it was considering something. Then it began to slide toward the hill. The buzzing built until it felt like my skull was being pulled apart. My vision blurred. And then silence. Darkness. I stayed in that tree until the first hint of grey touched the ridge. Every creak of bark, every small snap in the undergrowth sent a spike of panic through me. At one point, I heard a voice. My voice. Soft, almost playful. "Hello!" It floated up from the dark below like bait. I climbed higher and pressed my face into the bark, refusing to move. When daylight finally came, I scrambled down and ran for camp. Everything was there. Truck, gear, the cold skeleton of the fire. I packed in minutes, tires spinning mud as I tore down the trail. I checked the rear view every few seconds, half expecting to see something rising out of the trees. 2 miles later, I passed another camp. A family waved cheerfully as I went by. The father with a mug of coffee in his hand, kids tumbling around the fire. I thought about stopping, about asking them if they'd seen anything, but what would I even say? I told my dad later. He listened without interrupting. His brow was furrowed. When I finished, he said maybe it was some kind of military training, exercise, but there was no conviction in his voice, and he didn't meet my eyes. Years have passed, but some nights when the city holds its breath, I hear it again. That low, angry buzz swelling in the dark, and I wonder if whatever was in those woods still remembers me. A few friends and I were out squirrel hunting in a creek bottom years ago. We were on a large wilderness camping trip and had set up our tents. After the Saturday morning hunt, the afternoon wore on, and we could hear thunder getting closer quickly. We grabbed a big tarp from the back of my pickup and strung it up between the tents. We had to repitch one of the tents to get it under cover. Once a year, we get the guys together for a big outdoor trip lasting about a week. This required maintaining a campsite that could support us for the duration, ensuring no washouts, enough wood, nothing that would cause consistent problems, if avoidable. It's hard to describe how our camp looked. We had 2 tents facing each other, large old-style ball, tents with external poles. A big heavy tarp was strung up, supported by cut saplings partially covering both tents. We'd secured the tarp pretty well using white line we called trot line. We dug out a fire pit at the edge of the tarp, overhanging so the smoke would clear. With the storm coming, there was going to be no more hunting, at least for now. So, we got the fire going, brewed a pot of coffee, and started cooking something sweet. I don't remember exactly what, but it was bubbling on the side of the fire. We built a fancy multi-layered spit and put 4 squirrels on it to begin roasting. One of my buddies was squatting down, turning them. All of us would take turns rotating the spit until they were finished. The storm had been teasing, but now it finally hit, bringing lashing rain, thunder, and lightning. We were snug and comfortable, all congratulating ourselves on how cool we were camping out in a storm. No one had a pistol. We just had 3 shotguns. Mine was an 870 pump, and I remember mine was leaning up against one of the many saplings holding up our tarp. We weren't too concerned about camp intruders. The rain would keep most predators bedded down for the night. It was torrential, the kind of rain you can't even see through. Between that and the firelight, bears or wolves wouldn't be messing with us. Even then, we could have just sprayed them with our 12 gauges and then called it a night. We'd brought lawn chairs for the big campout, the old style from around 1979. 2 of us were sitting in ours, watching the third guy turn the squirrels and tend the coffee. Suddenly, and I mean so fast we didn't even see it happen, a man just stepped under our tarp and stood there. He walked up one side of my tent and was just stepping under the tarp. Instant shock and chaos ensued. I reared back and collapsed my chair, trying to get away from this guy. I scrambled for the shotgun. One buddy literally fell into the fire he was tending because he was so shocked. He burned his hands and face a bit. but his jacket took the brunt of the heat, thankfully. If he'd gotten severely burned, there's no way we'd be able to get him out of the woods and into a hospital, especially with a storm and mud. Our other friend just jumped up and ran full tilt into his tent, knocking it all askew. Later, he told me he thought he brought a pistol. He was rooting around in his duffel bag but came up empty-handed. The guy that stepped underneath the tarp started yelling something like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." I finally managed to free myself from the chair and jumped up. We were dead meat. There was a guy with a gun right here. He wasn't brandishing it though. He had the bolt pulled back and was still holding it across his chest. He was attempting to wave his own white flag of some kind. We quit hollering over one another and let the stillness take over. We let everyone show no sign of making a move. Even the friend in the tent poked his head out to get a look. It was a true standoff, and the only one I've ever been in. If he'd been carrying that rifle in any other way, I think we would have killed him out of fear. A potential life sentence type of mistake. After things calmed down a bit, it turned out this guy was just completely lost. He was already lost when the storm hit and had been wandering around in the heavy rain. He'd smelled the smoke from our fire and the squirrels cooking and followed it right to our camp. His rifle was a bolt-action .22 with the magazine. He was just some daytime hiker messing around in the forest when trouble hit. He was harmless, but the whole situation and the guy himself just gave me the creeps. He had this ear-to-ear grin that seemed almost impossibly wide, like special effects or something. I could hardly look this guy in the face because it just weirded me out that much. I don't know if the firelight cast weird shadows on his face or what, but I was the only one who seemed to notice it. It didn't seem like he blinked much either, even with water dripping in his eyes. When the man saw how badly he'd scared all of us, he apologized profusely. We ended up loading the guy into my truck and taking him out to the road and up to the pipeline where his car was parked. Only about a half a mile on relatively flat land. It was an easy drive, so I risked it just to get him out of camp. The guy was totally unthreatening, but he should have called out before ducking under the tarp and maybe acted a little more normally once he did, instead of scaring us all half to death. I was the night security officer for the clinic's main wing in True, Alaska. Technically, that's what my job title was. But really, I was the guy who made sure no raccoons chewed through the generator wires, that the lights stayed on, and that none of the back doors iced shut. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. And in a town where the grocery store closes at 5 p.m., steady mattered. The clinic was situated right at the edge of civilization. Beyond our fence, the road twisted once and disappeared into snow-covered nothing. After that, it was miles of frozen tundra, half-dead tree lines, the occasional set of snowshoe tracks, and silence. That kind of silence you don't really notice until you've been alone long enough to realize how loud quiet can be. I was supposed to be working with another guy, Paul, mid-50s, used to be a Coast Guard mechanic. He was decent company, but he'd torn something in his hip a few weeks earlier and got medevac to Anchorage. Just like that, I was solo. 12-hour shifts, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. in the dead of winter. The sun barely even tried. You might get 2 hours of grey around noon, then it was back to black. No foot traffic, no night staff, no real emergencies, unless someone fell through the ice or tried driving to another town and didn't make it. Even the occasional snowmobile drop-off usually happened around sunrise. Most nights were mind-numbingly routine. I'd park inside the fence, run a full circuit, check locks, gates, emergency systems, storage units, then post up in the security office with a coffee watching the perimeter cams loop. I had a flashlight, a radio no one answered, and a barely legal sidearm that rattled when I walked. That setup worked just fine until it didn't. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were usually dead, and I'd gotten in the habit of clocking how little happened. Around midnight, I stepped out to check the backup generator. We'd had a short power flicker the night before, and I wanted to make sure the fuel line hadn't frozen. The snow had that crunchy top layer that snaps under your boots. Dry and cold. Real cold. I was maybe 30 feet from the shed when I saw them. Two figures just standing at the tree line behind the west fence, not moving, not speaking. They were too far to make out clearly, but there was something off, even at a distance. Their posture was stiff, unnatural. They weren't shifting weight or tucking their hands into pockets like anyone else would have been doing in that kind of wind. They were just planted. No puff jackets, no reflective tape, no hats, no frost on their sleeves. They looked like cutouts, more than people. I didn't move, pulled my flashlight out slowly, not aiming it, just held it in my hand like I was thinking about it. They didn't react. Something about how they stood. It wasn't just strange, it was wrong, like they were pretending to be human and hadn't gotten the act quite right. After about 30 seconds, I turned away and started a slow walk around the lot. Tried to look casual, like I hadn't seen them, did my loop. Walked past the admin wing, swung back toward the generator. They were gone. No movement, no crunch of snow, no shadows cutting across the pole lights, just nothing. I checked the camera feed. Not a single frame showed them. The blind spot in that corner was just wide enough. 3 nights later, they came back. Same time, same place. I was more ready this time. Stared straight at them, flicked the flashlight on, didn't aim it, just clicked it as a warning. Then I reached down and unfastened the strap on my holster. Didn't draw, didn't want to escalate anything, just walked toward the rear fence slowly, letting them know I was watching. Again, no reaction. Then, like someone pressed rewind, they stepped backward into the trees. Not fast, not startled, just gone. I spent nearly an hour out there with the flashlight that time. Didn't see a single footprint. The snow hadn't even been disturbed. I didn't log it. What was I supposed to write? 2 people-shaped statues appeared and vanished. I wasn't sure what I'd seen, and I didn't feel like being the guy who cried cryptid in the middle of nowhere. That Friday, right before 1 a.m., I headed to the little break room tucked behind diagnostics. Not many people even remembered it was there. It used to be a records closet, then got repurposed with a microwave, a plastic table, and a couple of sad vending machines that were usually out of order. I made instant soup, one of those foam cups with the fake chicken pieces and way too much salt. I was halfway through stirring when I heard this sharp, clean knock, like plastic tapping ceramic. Not loud, but very distinct. I froze, waited. Nothing. Followed it. After about 30 seconds, I stepped into the doorway and listened. The heater was humming normally. Pipes settling, the usual background buzz. Nothing else. Told myself it was a stool tipping over. Maybe someone had left it perched funny, and it finally slid off balance. It made sense, kind of. I didn't finish the soup. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and walked the entire route. Every hallway, every closet, front lobby, diagnostics, imaging, admin, everything was in place. But when I reached the back corridor, the old part of the building where the emergency stairwell is, it felt colder. Not just a draft, like something had sucked the warmth out of the air. That stairwell hadn't been used in years. Too old. No elevator access, no alarm wiring. We kept it sealed with a heavy steel padlock and a rusty door bar. I checked it maybe once a week, more out of habit than concern. The lock was on the floor, snapped clean in half, like someone had twisted it until it shattered. One half was still stuck in the latch. The other lay in the dusting of snow that had blown in through the now partially open door. The bar had been forced upward, bent. The door was cracked just wide enough to show the first few steps disappearing into shadow. I didn't wait to investigate, didn't even lean closer. I turned, fast walked back to the office, locked myself in, and pulled up the security feed. Scrolled back to 12:07. There they were, the same 2 figures slipping in from the blind spot, near the old waste tank. They moved with purpose. One paused by the fence. The other moved straight toward the stairwell. They weren't wandering. They knew exactly where to go. They didn't touch the exam rooms, didn't check drawers. They walked right past surgery and supplies, straight to radiology. And on the monitor, I saw myself walking down the hall. As I reached the break room, one of them slipped into the room across the hall. He hit something. Must have been the stool. And I was sitting there drinking soup while he crouched an FT away, silent, armed. He stayed perfectly still the entire time I was in there, waiting, watching. When I got up, he stayed frozen for another second, then joined the other guy. Both exited with packs. One of them glanced back before ducking into the stairwell. I rewound it 5 times. One of them had something heavy in his hand. Could have been a crowbar. Could have been worse. I didn't want to guess. I called the troopers. They got there a little after 5, boots crunching against the tile when they came in. I showed him the footage. They didn't say much, just watched. One finally asked if I had seen those 2 before. I said yes. He didn't write it down, just exchanged a look with the other officer and said I should have the stairwell welded shut. The footage wasn't usable. No faces. Both wore masks. Their gear was plain. No labels, no shoes visible, nothing to trace. A few days later, the admin team quietly confirmed that a handful of archived data drives had gone missing. Still, they looked more worried than they should have. I've spent most of my life chasing skies. Not for glory, not for some poetic sense of destiny, but for something smaller, more selfish, because I like the way the earth breathes when no one's watching. The northern lights aren't just color in the air. They are alive. That's not poetry. That's how they feel when you're standing under them, like something breathing above you, something moving in ways you can't predict. People talk about them like they're a trick of physics, and maybe they are. Solar winds, geomagnetic storms, charged particles smashing into our atmosphere. I've read the books, heard the lectures, even explained it to paying customers 100 times. Science is a language that can name everything except the way it feels. It can't tell you what it's like to stand ankle deep in snow, in the middle of nowhere, with the air so cold your breath turns to crystals, while the entire sky folds and twists like silk in invisible hands. My name's Ethan Graves. I'm 37 years old, born in Anchorage, raised in a town too small for most maps. My father flew bush planes for a living, little 2-seaters that could land on lakes and sandbars and sometimes nothing more than a stretch of frozen ground. My mother taught elementary school in a building that smelled like wet wool and sawdust. Winters were long, summers short, the kind of place where if you didn't learn to respect the cold and never underestimate what lives in the wild, you didn't last long. I've been a guide for 12 years now. I've led people across rivers and pack rafts, hauled gear up glaciers, camped in valleys so remote even the air felt untrodden. I've had clients who wanted to fish, hike, paddle, but my bread and butter, the thing that keeps my lights on, is Aurora tours. People fly in from Tokyo, New York, London, thinking they're chasing a bucket list moment. They think it's about seeing the lights. What they're really after is proof. Proof they touch something rare, something most people never will. I give them that proof most nights. But there's one night I'd give anything to erase from my life. The night that taught me the lights don't just dance, they watch. And sometimes they wait. It was late February, the kind of month when the sun seems like an afterthought, when daylight barely crawls above the horizon before giving up. I had a premium tour booked. 4 clients, 2 couples from Texas, Liam and Hannah, Chris and Jordan, late 20s. Voices bubbling over the phone like champagne when they called 2 weeks earlier. "We want the real deal," Liam had told me. "None of that roadside crap. Take us deep. We want to see the lights where no one else is." That's the kind of request that stirs a guide's blood and ties a knot in his stomach at the same time. Deep wilderness means no cell signal, no quick exit, no one to call if something goes wrong. You pack for survival, not comfort. But the money was good, and I'd done it 100 times without incident. The forecast looked perfect. KP index strong, clear skies, no storms coming. I checked my gear twice. Extra fuel, satellite beacon, first aid kit, 44 Magnum revolver. Not for people, usually, but for moose, emergency blankets, fire starter, thermos of hot cocoa. I even packed spare gloves in case someone underestimated how quickly the cold can chew through fingers. They met me outside my shop at 4 sharp. The sun was already gone, leaving the kind of twilight that turned snow into glowing powder. My van idled in the lot, heater running, exhaust curling into the air like a lazy dragon's breath. Liam was the first out of their rental SUV. Stocky, tall, beard so neatly trimmed it looked manufactured. "Ethan," he said, shaking my gloved hand. "Man, we've been looking forward to this." Hannah followed, petite, sharp-featured eyes like little hooks that caught on everything. Chris and Jordan came next, still laughing about some joke I hadn't heard. Jordan climbed into the passenger seat without asking, settling in like he owned it. They were dressed in matching Arctic parkas, tags still hanging from one zipper. Texans, God help me. "You folks ready?" "Hell yeah." Jordan grinned. "We're seeing the lights tonight, right? Like guaranteed. They always ask that. Like the aurora is a switch you can flip on." I gave him the same answer I give everyone. Forecast is strong, but nature doesn't take orders. That's what makes it special. Jordan smirked like I'd told a joke. I didn't smile back. We headed north first, then west, trading asphalt for ice. The road narrowed. The dark pressed closer. Street lights gave way to black spruce and birch skeletons that clawed at the night. Now and then, snowmobiles had carved thin scars across the drifts. The first hour was filled with chatter, work gossip, vacation plans. Someone asking if I'd seen a specific TV show about Alaska. I answered politely, eyes fixed on the road. Out here, the weather and the land were always more important than the conversation. By the second hour, the cold began to work on them. People get quiet when the air feels like it's biting their lungs. Conversation dwindled to murmurs. All that was left was the crunch of tires over packed snow and the hum of the heater. Eventually, I turned onto a trail most folks wouldn't notice even in daylight. Unmarked, narrow, hemmed in by trees like a tunnel. My high beams turned the frost on the branches into pale ghosts. "This it?" Hannah asked softly. "Almost," I said. 15 minutes later, the forest opened like a wound into a clearing near, a frozen lake. No light pollution for 50 miles in any direction. I killed the engine. The silence dropped like a curtain. The cold bit deep, sharp enough to make your teeth ache. Above us, the stars burned savage and bright. Chris let out a low whistle. Holy hell, feels like planet. "Welcome to Alaska," I said, already moving to build a fire. Years of practice made it quick. The flames leapt up, orange heat pushing back the blue cold. They huddled close, their breath turning to steam. While we waited for the sky to open, I gave my usual spiel. Solar winds, magnetic fields, why the aurora happens at all. They nodded politely, eyes drifting upward every few seconds. Nobody comes for the science. They come for the moment. And then it began. A green arc sliced the horizon, faint, hesitant, then brightened like someone was dragging a paintbrush across black velvet. Another ribbon joined it, then another, rippling like silk caught in a wind we couldn't feel. Purple edged the green, crimson bled into the tips. The entire sky writhed with light. Hannah grabbed Liam's arm. Jordan just whispered, "Holy shit." Chris forgot to play it cool and stood gaping like a kid. I smiled. That's my favorite part. The silence that falls when people see something too big for them to process. I was watching their faces more than the lights. When I saw something move at the edge of my vision, a flicker, a shadow between the trees, I almost ignored it. Out here, your eyes lie to you. Shadows stretch, snow shifts, branches sway. But then Hannah spoke. "Did you guys hear that?" Her voice was thin. The others looked around. "Hear what?" Chris asked. "Like footsteps?" I listened. Nothing but the hiss of wind across the ice and the fire's crackle. Probably a moose, I said, forcing lightness into my voice. But something in my gut tightened. Moose make noise. They break branches, crunch through snow. This was different. Soft, deliberate. Jordan's voice cracked. Ethan, tell me that's a tree." I turned. Something stood beyond the tree line. Tall, too tall, 8', maybe more. Thin as a dead spruce, but wrong. The outline shimmered like heat, waves on asphalt. It was darker than the night around it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the aurora, shadows bending in the colored light. But then it moved. Not stepped, glided, smooth and silent. "What the hell is that?" Liam's voice was barely there. I kept my tone steady. Probably just branches messing with your eyes, but my pulse had already quickened.